di webinar Strategic Foresight for Policy Planning. Perkenalkan, nama saya diisi dari Pulse Lab Jakarta yang akan memandu jalannya webinar pada siang hari ini. Pertama-tama saya ingin mengucapkan selamat siang dan juga selamat datang kepada Pak Taufik Hanafi, Sekretaris Kementerian PPN Bappenas. Selamat datang dan selamat siang juga kepada Pak Muhammad Irfan Saleh, Kepala PLT Pusat Renbang Bappenas, kepada Pak Peter Kakareci, Kepala Pulse Lab Jakarta, kepada para pembicara webinar pada hari ini, Mingke, Laurent, Marius, dan juga Mbak Caca, selamat datang. Dan tentunya selamat siang dan selamat datang kepada Bapak Ibu, para pejabat di lingkungan Bappenas. United Nations Global Pulse bekerja sama dengan Pusat Renbang dan juga Direktorat Pengembangan Koperasi dan UKM Kementerian PPN Bappenas dalam kemitraan analitika untuk memperkuat usaha mikro, kecil, dan menengah atau UMKM dalam konteks pertumbuhan inklusif dan juga pembangunan yang berkelanjutan. Dan webinar ini merupakan salah satu rangkaian dari kegiatan untuk memperkenalkan pendekatan strategic foresight dalam perencanaan kebijakan. Sebelum memulai acara, saya akan membacakan beberapa hal yang perlu diperhatikan bersama untuk kelancaran webinar hari ini. Yang pertama, selama webinar berlangsung, kami menyediakan layanan penerjemah. Untuk Bapak Ibu sekalian, silakan dapat diklik di tombol kanan bawah layar Zoom.
The interpretation feature icon on the bottom right of your screen to listen to both English and Indonesian languages. You
can answers ada di bawah, atau di Slido yang juga nanti linknya akan kami bagikan di dalam chat. Baiklah, untuk memulai acara ini, pertama-tama saya akan mengundang kepada Sekretaris Kementerian PPN Bappenas, Bapak Taufik Hanafi, untuk menyampaikan sambutannya. Kepada Pak Sesmen, kami persilahkan.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for to keep you waiting. Very good morning, Finland. So I believe in Finland right now is in Helsinki is rain. The weather system. Yes. 12 degrees Celsius. Yeah. So, Madam Minke Mayan, yes, thank you very much, Mr. Lauren, and also, Mr. Marius. So, I keep looking from my computers and also. Yes, I believe that from Finland is 3 speakers. Yes, and I also visited Helsinki, I think 2 years ago before pandemics. We had the SDGs evaluation programs. Took place in the Ministry of Education's building at that time. Yes. Okay, very good afternoon, Jakarta. We have Petra. So you look very fit right now because Jakarta is every day is almost sunny day. Yes, every day sunny day. And Ibu Mariska, our distinguished speakers. Mr. Irfan Saleh, head of the data center, Bappenas, and my colleagues from Bappenas is Deputy Minister and also special staff to the Minister, Director, planners, and participants. Welcome to the webinar on the strategic foresight for policy planning. I believe it's very important topic. Ministry of National Development Planning is right now is preparing what we call the long-term and medium-term development plan. Yes, for long-term is 2025 until 2045. For medium-term is 2025 until
25 sampai 2029. Mungkin saya juga bisa share nanti kepada
far away from Indonesia is I don't know how many thousand kilometers from Indonesia is far away, the North Pole. Yes, And last week, Ministry of National Development Planning, Bappenas, organized development working groups, G20 meeting, September 7 to 9 in Belitung Islands, Indonesia. The meeting was attended by delegations coming from almost 40 countries and international institutions, and also attended by 15 ministers. Yes, I'm very pleased, and on behalf of Ministry of National Development Planning, Bappenas, I would like to extend my appreciation to EU delegation. It's also attended the DWG G20 meeting for attending development working groups in Belitung, Indonesia. So that is interesting that I want to share with you. During the bilateral meeting with the EU, there were two important issues being discussed by Indonesia and the EU. First, on the green and blue economy. That's the second issue is energy transition. Yeah. So I believe the strategic foresight approach is also used, in understanding, exploring, and also identifying important challenges on the areas of blue economy, green economy, and energy transition. Yes, that's what. So once again, thank you for strong support from EU for the Indonesia G20 presidency. So actually, it's just a couple of days ago, just finished, and thank you. So I also want to report that many of the participants, I believe this participant is right now coming up. Yes, is over 100, close to 170. Yes, many of them just finished participating on the workshop on the scenario planning. So just a couple of days ago. So they attended the scenario planning workshops also for the preparation in formulating, the issues, challenges in the future. So I believe that the strategic foresight also, plays important role in identifying strategic, critical issues and challenges in the future. So I think this webinar can enrich and complement our approach and expanding our understanding on the role of strategic foresight in preparing long-term and medium-term development plan. So in this opportunity, once again, I would like to express my appreciation to distinguished speakers far away from Jakarta. It's like, it's like we sitting next to the room, not ocean, not country, just different rooms. Yes, it's like, I can see you very clear from just maybe 30 centimeters from my desk. Yeah, this is very close. Yes, and I also want to express my appreciation to Jakarta Pulse Lab, UN Global Pulse Finland, and Data Center Bappenas for the excellent collaboration in organizing this webinar. So once again, panelists, I wish you all very productive meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you Pak Sensmen, terima kasih banyak Pak sudah menyampaikan kata sambutannya. Kami juga mencatat bagaimana nanti mungkin beberapa prioritas dari G20 bisa juga melakukan dengan pendekatan strategic foresight. Terima kasih Pak Sensmen. Untuk selanjutnya, saya mempersilahkan kepada Pak Petra Kakareci, Head of Pulse Lab Jakarta, untuk juga bisa dapat menyampaikan sambutannya. Pak Petra, kami persilahkan.
Terima kasih Bu Desi. Yang saya hormati Pak Taufik Hanafi. Terima kasih banyak Pak Taufik atas actually I wanted to speak first in English if that's okay. Pak Taufik, just wanted to thank you for your leadership and guidance for Pulse Lab Jakarta and the progression that we've been able to make, and particularly also for the support and leadership of Pak Irfan Saleh, Ibu Tatik, and the team in Pusat in Rendang, and also with the Directorate for Micro, Small, and Medium Enterprises, with Pak Dading, and particularly with Ibu Caca. So I'm so happy to see Ibu Caca also as one of our distinguished speakers, as well as my huge appreciation to our other distinguished speakers, Lauren, Minka, and Marius. So much appreciate your inputs and taking the time here. If I might continue in Indonesian on some notes, I'd just like to express on this occasion. Jadi Bapak Ibu, terima kasih banyak, dan terima kasih juga atas kehadiran Ibu Bapak. Saya lihat ada Pak Rudi yang saya sangat hormati, Pak Leo Tapogolan juga, dan apresiasi kami bahwa Bapak juga mau turut menghadiri webinar ini. Nah, seminar atau webinar ini merupakan rangkaian dari kegiatan Pulse Lab Jakarta sebagai wujud dari kemitraan antara Global Pulse dan Bappenas dalam menggunakan pendekatan strategic foresight untuk perencanaan kebijakan. Kegiatan ini juga sejalan dengan arahan steering committee di bawah kepemimpinan Pak Taufik Hanafi sekarang, dan sebelumnya di bawah Pak Himawan, agar Pulse Lab Jakarta beralih dari sekedar pengembangan konsep dan prototip ke pengembangan kapasitas operasional melalui pendekatan-pendekatan yang inovatif tapi juga aplikatif. Nah, semenjak awal tahun ini, tim kami bersama-sama dengan Direktorat PUKMK menggunakan pendekatan Foresight untuk mengeksplorasi skenario-skenario masa depan yang dapat mempengaruhi sektor UMKM di Indonesia dalam 5-20 tahun mendatang, terutama melihat bahwa sektor ini menjadi salah satu kebijakan tulang punggung dalam kebangkitan atau penguatan ekonomi pasca pandemi COVID-19. Dari proses ini kami melihat pendekatan Foresight ini juga cukup menarik atau sangat menarik apabila bisa diterapkan oleh Bappenas untuk sektor-sektor lainnya. Untuk itu webinar hari ini diharapkan dapat memberikan gambaran mengenai bagaimana pendekatan strategic foresight dapat dipergunakan untuk perencanaan kebijakan, khususnya untuk Bappenas sebagai pengampu perencanaan pembangunan, dan sejalan juga dengan apa yang disampaikan oleh Pak Sesmen bahwa kami juga dalam proses penyusunan RPJMN dan RPJP ke depan. Nah, dalam hal ini kami berharap bahwa apa yang akan disampaikan bukan saja oleh pakar dari luar, tetapi juga oleh tim yang dipimpin oleh Ibu Mariska dalam penerapan pendekatan Future Foresight ini, dengan masukan-masukan yang diperoleh dari webinar ini akan membantu atau juga mendukung Bapak Ibu dalam pengembangan dan pelaksanaan tugas dan fungsi yang begitu penting bagi masa depan bangsa. Terima kasih sekali lagi, dan semoga webinar ini betul-betul bermanfaat bagi kita semua. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak Pak Petra atas kata sambutannya. Baik Bapak dan Ibu, kita sebentar lagi akan segera mendengar beberapa paparan dari 4 narasumber kita yang hadir luar biasa pada hari ini. Sebelumnya izinkan saya untuk bisa memperkenalkan secara singkat dari 4 narasumber hari ini. Yang pertama adalah Ibu Minke. Ibu Minke merupakan Strategic Foresight Specialist dari Pulse Lab Finland yang memiliki banyak sekali pengalaman di proyek-proyek terkait dengan Foresight. Kemudian yang kedua ada Pak Marius. Pak Marius merupakan Learning and Transformation Practice Lead dari School of International Futures. Sebagai Global Futurist, Marius juga sudah mengalami banyak sekali beberapa proyek di berbagai sektor terkait dengan future dan foresight. Beliau juga memiliki fokus di dalam strategic foresight dan juga skenario planning yang tadi mungkin Pak Sesmen juga sempat mention. Jadi beliau sudah memiliki beberapa pengalaman terkait dengan hal tersebut. Yang ketiga ada Pak Laurang. Pak Laurang merupakan Senior Foresight for Policy Expert dari European Commission Joint Research Center. Beliau juga memiliki berbagai pengalaman dalam hal foresight, utamanya di lingkungan EU. Yang terakhir, seperti yang tadi sudah disampaikan oleh Pak Petra, kita punya Ibu Mariska yang merupakan perencana di Direktorat PUKMK. Mbak Caca sendiri juga terlibat dalam proyek yang saat ini sedang kami kerjakan bersama untuk melihat bagaimana future of MSMEs di Indonesia. Baik, untuk memulai webinar hari ini, pertama-tama saya mau mulai ke Mingke. Namun sebelum kita persilakan Mingke untuk bisa menyampaikan presentasinya, saya ingin Bapak Ibu bisa mengakses Slido. Mungkin Angga bisa di-share screen untuk Slido-nya. Ya, bisa akses di sini. Oh, mungkin sudah ada yang mulai mengisi. Terima kasih. Bisa akses ke Slido, kemudian Bapak Ibu bisa menyampaikan kira-kira hal yang pertama kali muncul di benak Bapak Ibu ketika pertama kali mendengar kata-kata strategic foresight itu apa sih? Mungkin bisa sambil kita melihat hasilnya, ada yang bilang future, planning for future, ada juga, wah menarik ini, leap of faith, ada yang skeptical juga, kemudian kita ada yang lihat planning for the future, menarik. Cukup banyak yang bilang future ya, jadi pokoknya strategic foresight sepertinya kita melihat masa depan tuh seperti apa. Kemudian ada juga must be visionary, skenario, vision. Ada juga yang bilang limitless, karena mungkin ya kita kalau melihat masa depan tidak terbatas seperti itu. Just development, kemudian ada juga possibility, menarik. Mungkin berarti masa depan itu banyak sekali kemungkinan ya, sepertinya kalau misalnya dari masukan seperti ini. Kemudian ada juga analitik, ada forecast. Mungkin nanti kita bisa dengar dari Bu Mingke, apa sih perbedaan antara foresight dan juga mungkin dengan forecast. Oke, kita bisa lihat main sebetulnya ada planning for the future, accurate, future, dan juga shaping the future dengan uncertainty juga. Baik, terima kasih banyak Bapak Ibu atas masukannya, apa yang pertama kali terpikir kalau misalnya mendengar strategic foresight, ini transisi yang pas untuk kita bisa lanjut ke Bu Mingke yang bisa menyampaikan kepada kita kira-kira apa sebetulnya strategic foresight. So Mingke, I would like to go first with you. Could you share with us what is actually strategic foresight? So the floor is yours, Mingke.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Daisy, for the kind introduction words and also for the other distinguished guests and speakers. So let me first take this opportunity as well to really thank you and saying that we are so honored that we have this partnership together with Bappenas, because you've been such a great partner in the willingness to innovate and to experiment with strategic foresight. I had the pleasure the last few months to kind of facilitate this group of horizon scanners to do this horizon scan for the future of MSMEs. Yes, and I've been really impressed by the eagerness to learn and the commitment and the dedication of the scanners, and not only the scanners, but actually from the broader group of people within Bappenas that have been part of this. So I'm actually really looking forward to the next few months where we kind of work on finalizing this report and at this big launch event in September. But I think Mariska will talk a bit more about that as well. And indeed, it's very cold. It's in Finland here. It's not yet like North Pole circumstances, but for sure autumn has started. So thank you for your sympathies over there. But as I only have a 5-minute, really short, brief kickoff here, I would delve in straight away, like what is strategic foresight and why do we actually need it today? When talking about strategic foresight, I think it's important to think that we make kind of 3 core assumptions. The first one is that there are many plausible futures. There's not only
masa depan yang akan terjadi. Tidak hanya satu versi, tetapi ada banyak kemungkinan masa depan yang akan terjadi. Dan asumsi yang kedua adalah skenario ini atau masa depan ini bisa kita pengaruhi. Dan bahkan kita juga punya tanggung jawab untuk memastikan masa depan yang lebih baik. Selain itu, ini tidak hanya memerlukan pemahaman tentang isu-isu saat ini seperti yang kita lakukan pada horizon scanning, tapi kita juga ingin mengeksplorasi apa saja masa depan alternatif dan juga apa saja dampak dari masa depan alternatif tersebut. Dan satu elemen lain dari strategic foresight adalah bahwa strategic foresight ini juga menantang kita untuk menguji asumsi-asumsi yang mungkin kita miliki tentang masa depan. Karena semua orang tentunya punya asumsi sendiri tentang masa depan, tetapi dengan strategic foresight kita akan mengeksplorasi masa depan yang kita inginkan dan juga melihat apakah asumsi-asumsi kita itu valid atau tidak. Karena asumsi tentang masa depan ini yang akan menjadi mempengaruhi apa saja yang kita lakukan sekarang. Jadi singkat saja, strategic foresight adalah suatu pendekatan terorganisir dan sistematis untuk memikirkan tentang masa depan dan juga menjadi basis pembuatan keputusan. Memikirkan tentang masa depan ini juga menjadi bagian dari pembuatan keputusan. Ini bukan hal yang baru sebenarnya, tetapi kita lakukan dengan cara yang terstruktur, komprehensif, dengan pendekatan tertentu di dalam pemerintahan khususnya. Ini adalah hal yang baru dan kita ingin mengklaim ruang di mana kita bisa memikirkan secara lebih jangka panjang dan melihat apa saja kompleksitas dan strategi apa yang bisa kita lakukan terkait dengan masa depan. Dan ini seringkali disalahpahami dengan, oh barangkali ini melihat atau menerawang ke masa depan, dan ini bukan sebenarnya prinsip dari strategic foresight. Jadi ini bukan forecasting, tetapi sebenarnya forecast yang menjadi konsep yang juga berbeda. Kita tidak bisa memprediksi masa depan, ini juga punya keterbatasannya sendiri, khususnya di dunia di mana kita berurusan.
What is actually valuable is you want to explore a range of plausible futures and what this could actually mean for you, but also for your organization and for the policy actions that you want to take. So why do we need foresight? Why do we need it now? Well, you see that I think we all know that we have this change in the world that is growing quite exponentially. It's growing more complex and it's really harder to predict. But at the same time, our current practices of understanding the world are becoming more obsolete. So there is an increasing relevance gap. And this is only increasing while the world is becoming more and growing more complex. And we see this already within our own organization and with other organizations as well, that our current approaches really do not match the complexity of the challenges that we have that we're facing today. We're focusing very much on the short-term course directions, focus on economic optimization, and that's not enough. We need to kind of focus on the long term and address the challenges with truly transformative efforts. We have to stretch our thinking, and that's not an easy task, but we really need to overcome that short-term bias and to rethink and reimagine a range of possible futures. So that's why we need foresight. And luckily, our own Secretary General of the UN has also endorsed and stressed the need for strategic foresight himself. In his Our Common Agenda, the report of the Secretary General, he endorsed really the use of strategic foresight to move away from this kind of incremental progress model and to really kind of be able to envision radical different futures and disruptive solutions. He framed it as a wake-up call. We need to use foresight to really move away from the business as usual and to use futures and foresight to really understand that kind of the stark choice here that is upon us. It's on the one hand, we have this breakdown scenario, right, of this kind of a world of permanent crisis marked by deadly pandemics and an uninhabitable planet because of climate change and inequalities that are hugely destabilizing. Foresight is actually, and I really appreciated that came up already in that Slido, is that it needs to be visionary, right? We want to use strategic foresight to actually move towards that preferred future, to the breakthrough scenario that is actually, towards an international system that is actually delivering to the people on the planet. So final word, I think the UN is really seeing this strategic foresight as kind of a pivotal, a strategic pivot, where we really want to bring different strategic perspectives together and really questioning our current ways of working and our current ways of thinking. So and I think Bappenas has been an excellent partner in doing this already. Let's take this opportunity, right? And let's take this momentum to actually build upon that and think about new innovative ways of doing business and designing policies. So I hope I've stayed within my limited five minute talk, and I'll then hand it over again to Daisy. But I'm really looking forward to the other presentations and the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mika. It's very good start for us to understand more about what is the strategic foresight. And you mentioned it's a wake-up call to move away from the business as usual. So now I would like to move to Marius. Now we already understand a bit about what is strategic foresight. I would like to expand a bit and explore what is actually strategic foresight is crucial for policy planning. And maybe if you could share a bit as well, like what are the key elements in applying this strategic foresight in policy planning? So Marius, the floor is yours.
Well, colleagues, thank you very much. And it's really wonderful to be with you. Thank you for the kind opening remarks. And we're excited to see that you are showing an interest in deepening your capability for foresight and using foresight within government planning. I am involved with the School of International Futures, as was said. We work around the world supporting governments and private and public institutions on strategy and policy, specifically thinking about long-term and future generations. And so I'll be speaking from that perspective and maybe touching on some of the work that we're doing with UN Global Pulse as we think about enhancing the foresight capability within the UN system in particular. A good starting point is perhaps to mention this creature called chameleon, which of course I'm sure you'll have a similar creature in Africa. We have them. And they have this unique ability that they have the ability to look forward as well as back at the same time. Their eyes have that unique capability. And so what we learn from this creature is that really, if we're going to be successful in the future, we have to have the ability to look forward as well as back, or back as well as forward. Very often, especially as government, we have what we call legacy issues, issues of culture, issues of history, issues of social, embedded social difficulties. And so while we grapple and struggle to address those historical issues, we also have to be visionary. And so this creates this challenge or this tension between hindsight and what we call foresight. Very often in government planning units or planning departments, rely very heavily on data. And data, by its definition, is historical because we cannot measure the future. We cannot observe the future through scientific means as we study historical data or trends. And so what we tend to do is we develop very, very powerful hindsight, which is information about the past. And then we expect that the future is going to be like the past. And so this is what forecasting is. It's the future, it's the past with bells and whistles, or it's the past plus 5%. And so this is what Minka referred to as the assumptions that we make about the future, because all our knowledge is in the past. It might be true that we have some individuals in our organization with wonderful hindsight, 20 years of experience, 50 years of long-term historical perspective. And it might be true that we have some individuals in the organization with wonderful insight, deep understanding of the current situation. But what foresight does is it shifts the conversation from hindsight and insight, and it adds to them foresight, the ability to think about the future, grapple with what that future might mean, and then formulate strategies and policies for that future. Now, Minka also mentioned this idea of the rate of change. In a world of large-scale disruption, whether it's socioeconomic disruption through inequality, whether it's global pandemics causing economic shocks, shocks in food security, whether it's the emergence of technology, these changes and the combination of these changes are of such a scale and such a speed that our institutions are not changing fast enough. If we're in a formal government institution that is still operating on the technology, the processes, the mindset of 1960, 1980, 2020, but we're in a world where the society is operating on the technology of 2020 and 2025. They're operating on the future human settlements of 2030, 2040 in the wake of migration and climate shocks and uncertainties like that. We have to develop an ability as an institution to shift our mindset away from past and think about what is the long-term impact of artificial intelligence? What is the long-term impact of new trade relations in our region in Asia? What is the long-term impact of shifting culture, shifting values among the youth? And so Foresight offers us a tool, a systematic way of thinking about how these disruptions are going to affect us. Now, one of our futurist colleagues out of Australia, Marie Conway, makes the statement that Foresight is really a systematic and organized way of working with uncertainty, of engaging uncertainty. We cannot predict the future, as Vinka said, but we can anticipate the future, or we can anticipate multiple alternative futures and prepare ourselves for those futures. How do we do that? We do that by looking at things like drivers of change on the left-hand side, analyzing what is causing a shift in culture, what is causing the acceleration of technology. We do that by using systems thinking of how these drivers interact with each other. How does politics interact with economics? How does politics and economics at the domestic level interact with politics and economics at the regional level? We use systems thinking to do that. And then we use scenario thinking to bring that analysis into images of the future or stories about the future or scenarios about the future, like the scenarios we did with the Supreme Council of Planning in Oman, to think about what is the future of Oman in 2040? What is the future of the oil industry? What is the future of employment in 2040? Now, these tools become very powerful in preparing ourselves to address the SDGs. How do we think about the future of food when you have 3D printed food, for instance, or micro farms in urban centers? How do we think about the future of education? And so we can use these tools not only to understand uncertainty, but to target our thinking, our policy thinking and our strategy thinking across the SDGs. So what is the real value of doing Foresight? What Foresight does is it helps leaders, policymakers, business leaders, government officials, planners, it helps them manage amidst uncertainty. We're in an environment where uncertainty is high, and because uncertainty is high, it's difficult to make decisions in such uncertainty. And so what strategic foresight does is it helps us make better strategic choices. It helps us build preparedness. What would you have done differently if you knew in 2019 that there would be a global COVID pandemic? Or what would you do differently if you knew that there would be a Ukraine crisis and a food crisis associated with that? And so it helps us to develop the sensing network for future preparedness. The third one is it helps us to develop alert organizations. So instead of organizations that meet and have an agenda which talks about the past, which is our annual report, our quarterly report, our 5-year report, all of which are about the past, it helps us build organizations that can talk about the future, that have the tools to be alert to what's happening around us, to develop anticipation, awareness, and agility. Now, we at SOIF, at the School of International Futures, we've developed a structured, systematic approach of doing this, from scoping the Foresight project we want to do, to ordering our analysis in that project, to investigating what are the implications of the Foresight, and then to integrating that Foresight into our organization. I want to talk for a few minutes quickly about integrating Foresight, because this is what becomes really important. Now, as I do that, let me ask you, if you would, in the chat, to answer this question by putting a number in the chat. If you had to rate your government for how prepared is the government currently for the future, what would you say? Is it completely unprepared? Is it somewhere a little bit behind where it should be? Maybe you say it's starting to get prepared, or making steady progress, or perhaps you feel like fully prepared. How would you rate government currently in terms of its future preparedness? And as you reflect on that, let me quickly talk about integrated futures. There's some wonderful examples around the world of governments that have integrated futures or foresight into their public institutions. In South Africa, where I live, we've done that a number of times through civil society, in the Montvleur scenarios, through the government, the presidency doing scenarios. We've also done that more recently with government, business, and civil society, labor together, doing a joint participative scenario process called the Indulamiti scenarios. We also see this in countries like Mexico at the city level. Gabriela Gomez Mont looking at the urban experiential labs, looking at the future of cities. We see this in Finland, of course, with a person appointed in the office of the Prime Minister, working with the Committee for the Future, which is, of course, in the Parliament, where right at the center of government, there's the capacity to think about the long-term future, to talk to leaders in Parliament, in the Committee for the Future, about the long-term future, and to involve government departments across the state in those futures. And then, of course, we see this in sectors, the likes of the World Food Programme, the World Economic Forum, as well as the World Food Programme doing scenarios on the future of food. And so we see institutions around the world implementing foresight, embedding foresight, and really what they're doing is number one, they're creating immediate insights. And this is a real opportunity for governments. Choose a policy area. Maybe you're interested in the future of urban mobility in cities. Choose a policy area, develop immediate insights about the future, or create incentives and build capacity for foresight in the country. Fund chairing futures at the university, convene scholars in futures with government, so building that capability in the government. Also create long-term awareness on key risks, such as COVID, etc. But most importantly, what I'll finish on is how do we build an ecosystem for foresight? Now, we've done some research about how governments around the world have used foresight. And what our research shows is 4 things. Number one, you have to do foresight in a way that is contextually relevant, that responds to the socio-cultural reality of the environment. So Indonesia would need foresight that is fit for purpose in Indonesia. Number 2, you have to put the foresight in the right context with regards to how government functions. Is government a monarchy? Is it a democracy? Is it a parliamentary system? And how do we use foresight in that specific system? And then number 3, which is the one I want to focus on, we need to think of building a foresight ecosystem. It's not effective when you have one individual somewhere in an office doing foresight and having a foresight report, because then no one understands the foresight. No one uses the foresight. We have to build a foresight ecosystem that involves multiple parties, multiple institutions, the Department of Finance, with the Department of Planning, with the business community, together doing participative foresight becomes very, very powerful. And I'll share with you after the session some of the principles of the culture, the structures, the people, and the processes that you can develop in such a foresight ecosystem. And then let me finish by saying we think that there are 4 ways in which you can immediately activate your institution to use foresight. Number 1 is to connect with practitioners and colleagues who do foresight, as we're doing today. By hosting these kinds of conversations, we share the learning. Number 2, raise awareness around future trends with senior leaders. Foresight needs to have sponsorship from the top. And so by getting senior leaders like the Secretary General in the UN, Antonio Guterres, to become aware of the need to think about futures becomes very powerful in implementing futures across the institution. Number 3, discuss these key external trends and drivers among colleagues. Create spaces where these conversations can happen. And number 4, of course, reach out to those in the UN system, as you're doing today, who have these skills, who are available to support. And we, of course, would love to work with you on that. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion that will follow.
Thank you so much, Marius. Very insightful. I really take a lot of notes, as you mentioned. So there are a lot of benefits that we can take by integrating foresight into our policy planning to build vision, to manage risk, anticipation, awareness, and agility, and how we can actually also apply it by, starting from now. We already connect with the practitioners. We're also trying to raise awareness. And I'm glad that earlier in the opening remarks, assessment also mentioned that actually Bappenas already started to think about scenario planning. So looking forward for further discussion with you, Marius. A lot of questions already coming in to us. So thank you so much. So before I move a bit to Laurent, I would like to invite the participants. Bapak Ibu, saya mengundang kembali untuk bisa masuk ke Slido lagi. Setelah mendengarkan apa yang disampaikan oleh Mingke, kemudian disampaikan juga oleh Marius mengenai strategic foresight dan bagaimana itu bisa bermanfaat untuk policy planning, mungkin bisa di-up untuk Slido-nya. Saya ingin bisa melihat kira-kira bagaimana menurut Bapak Ibu dalam hal apa kira-kira pekerjaan Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan semua bisa memanfaatkan pendekatan foresight ini. Mungkin kita bisa up untuk Slido-nya. Ya, jadi mungkin saya bisa minta kira-kira dalam hal apa setelah tadi dijelaskan kira-kira strategic foresight bisa bermanfaat. Saya udah lihat long-term planning, kemudian semakin meningkatkan kepercayaan diri untuk bisa membuat planning, stability, kemudian time frame mapping, karena betul di foresight kita bisa melihat mungkin jangka menengah, 5, 10 tahun, 15 tahun, 20 tahun ke depan. Kemudian to be more anticipatory about the future. Kemudian juga ada soal leading dan anticipating seperti apa yang tadi Mario sudah sampaikan. More coming, helping country to anticipate the futures. Very interesting. Kemudian juga ada bagaimana untuk bisa memberikan konteks kira-kira apa yang mungkin kita bisa achieve di kemudian hari seperti apa. Dan juga additional tool for policy making. Tentunya foresight nanti bisa dikombinasikan dengan beberapa metode lainnya yang tentunya sudah dijalankan oleh Bappenas. Terima kasih banyak. Ini justru menjadi bridging kita untuk kemudian kita bisa diskusi selanjutnya untuk mendengarkan dari Laurent mengenai kira-kira, maybe Laurent, now we already understand the strategic foresight, what is the benefit of us integrating it into policy planning. Now I would like to expand a bit again from your perspective. Maybe you can share with us the practical use case or the example to apply strategic foresight in the context of policy planning. Maybe also you could give some examples how you apply foresight in the European Union context. So the floor is yours, Laurent.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen quickly. So we can move this. Here, okay, hang on a second. That's probably better. So thank you very much for inviting me today to this seminar. I am very grateful. And the first two presentations by Minke and Marius have been explaining very well what foresight is, and how best to use foresight. So I'm going to try and explain to you in one example, how this can look like in a real case. So I'm coming from the European Commission's Joint Research Center, which is one of the biggest Directorates General of the European Commission, which is spread across 5 countries in the EU, and it has about 2,000 researchers. And we're a small group of about 17 people doing foresight there in Brussels. And we've been doing foresight in the Commission for a long time. So to really give a very short overview of the history of foresight in the EU system, the first trace I could find of a body in the EU institutions actually doing foresight was in 1987 with a body in the European Parliament called the Science and Technology Options Assessment Office, where people were doing essentially technology foresight. And in 1989, the president of the European Commission created the foresight cell, the cellule de prospective, that was Jacques Delors at the time, who wanted to have socioeconomic insights to feed his policy, which were really oriented towards the future. And at the same time, a friend of his who was working also at the JRC and the Joint Research Center said, yes, but we are in a very technological world. So if we have socioeconomic foresight for policy, we should also have technology foresight for policy. And so they also created this Institute for Prospective Technological Studies in the JRC in 1989 to really look at all these questions of technology foresight. After that, there were changes in governance. There were new people who came in who did not have this foresight culture. And then for a few years, foresight was maybe less used in the institutions. But by 2010, foresight had come back with force. And then there was the creation of the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System by the European Parliament, which was an interinstitutional EU network to really discuss global trends and how global trends could influence the future of the EU. And so that, launched again this culture of foresight in the EU institutions. And by 2013, foresight activities at the JRC had moved then from ISPRA, from the Italian site and Seville, back to Brussels. It started to raise its profile. And the Directorate General for Research starting to fund foresight research, using the multi-annual framework program for research of the European Union. So that really fed, or primed the pump, let's say, and fed the activities. And by 2017, we were created. We at the JRC, the Competence Center on Foresight, where we started to actually do a lot more, visible projects on demand for policy at the EU level. By 2019, one of the commissioners and even a vice president of the commission was given a mission letter, a role in strategic foresight. So that was really a milestone. They gave a lot of political visibility to strategic foresight. And then since 2020, we started to produce annual strategic foresight reports. And at the same time, following this new initiative in the commission, a number of foresight services were created in the European Council, in the Economic and Social Committee, and in the European Committee of the Regions. So you have a dynamic that was created to actually include foresight in policy thinking across the board of all EU institutions. And then in 2021, the Vice President started to animate this government foresight network across all the member states of the European Union. So in a nutshell, that's the long history of foresight for policy in the EU. So building on what the previous speaker said, I think a few key points emerged already, that show what it takes to have good quality foresight for policy. And one of the first points is to actually involve the decision makers, in the foresight, and make sure to define the scope of the foresight project with them, to really give foresight this strategic nature, which is what it needs to actually have the most impact. I think another important point is to be able to work in foresight with all the relevant stakeholders to be able to establish the legitimacy of the outcomes of the foresight process, because everybody's been part of this. And that actually increases the capacity to also influence decisions afterwards. If everybody has been part of the discussion, everybody's been building this collective intelligence about the future, then it's easier to use the results of foresight. Using structured methods, I think the School of International Futures, really made that point. We have a strong toolkit, and we have to actually make sure that we use it and we use it well. When we went to do foresight for policy, we've discovered that it's also important to coordinate, with the political calendar. So the reflection exercises, the results of the foresight, have to be coherent with the moment when decisions or key discussions in policy are taking place to have the maximum influence. And also, because foresight can be a bit abstract and sometimes uses some jargon, we have to make an effort to adopt the political language to really communicate what we learn from foresight well impact the minds of decision makers. And then, of course, foresight is something that requires homework. So we have to invest in the evaluation of the results. So when we've done an exercise, look back at it. What did we do right? What did did we do wrong, and learn from past experience, and also make sure that we do the homework in terms of data collection, production of knowledge, analysis of all the discussions that are taking place in foresight processes. Two important points that were made also very quickly in the previous presentations. Foresight is no prediction.
Sebelumnya, foresight ini bukan prediksi dan bukan forecast, bukan perakiraan. Saya rasa poin yang penting juga adalah bahwa foresight adalah suatu bentuk intelijensi kolektif. Bahwa foresight ini bukan sesuatu yang dilakukan satu orang saja di kantornya sendirian. Jadi ini dilakukan secara kolektif dengan melibatkan semua stakeholder. Karena pada akhirnya keputusan yang dibuat, kalau kita membuat keputusan dan tidak ada yang terlibat, maka tentunya ini tidak akan bisa berhasil. Jadi kita harus memasukkan input dari semua pihak. Foresight yang baik memerlukan waktu dan freedom atau kebebasan. Ini kita harus punya fleksibilitas agar pikiran kita ini tidak dibatasi dan eksplorasi kita tidak dibatasi. Metode dan metode-metode yang digunakan juga akan saya bahas nanti di presentasi saya. Dan itu poin lain yang ingin saya sampaikan adalah bahwa seringkali perencanaan skenario ini bisa menghasilkan skenario yang baik dan juga mengembangkan format-format yang lebih singkat. Jadi menggunakan sesi-sesi yang singkat, misalnya dalam beberapa jam saja kita bisa melakukan sesi refleksi. Jadi ini adalah serangkaian tool dan alat yang kita gunakan untuk perencanaan skenario. Ada scenario planning, horizon scanning juga salah satu metode yang digunakan. Jadi ada banyak sekali metode-metode dan alat untuk foresight. Jadi ini adalah overview dari foresight yang digunakan di dunia nyata untuk menetapkan keputusan dari Uni Eropa. Tahun 2018 dirayakan 50 tahun Customs Union di sana. Dan selama 50 tahun ini mereka merasa bahwa ada banyak hal yang berubah di dunia ini menjadi semakin kompleks. Jadi kita memerlukan refleksi jangka panjang untuk memastikan bahwa kita memasukkan perubahan-perubahan ini ke depannya. Jadi pada saat itu Direktur Jenderalnya mencoba untuk mengumpulkan para anggota-anggota dan pemikir dan think tank. Lalu mereka juga meyakini bahwa mereka butuh lebih banyak dari yang mereka butuhkan dan akhirnya bisa membawa kebijakan Customs Union ke level selanjutnya. Jadi kami bekerja sama dengan Customs Union. Kita juga ada beberapa kegiatan-kegiatan selama 1 tahun. Jadi kita mulai tahun 2019 bulan Februari untuk pemetaan sistem. Jadi apa saja customs di Uni Eropa, apakah mereka sudah memahami semuanya? Jadi kita lakukan pemetaan dulu. Jadi sistem-sistem yang kita lihat saat ini yang sedang berjalan kita petakan dulu, lalu juga siapa saja stakeholdernya dan juga ekspertis atau keahlian mereka apa saja. Selain itu kita melakukan horizon scanning dan juga memasukkan proses foresight dengan informasi solid sebanyak mungkin ya. Jadi di sini kita juga sudah mengembangkan
about 45 group of people representing all the key states, representatives of the countries with which the EU was trading a lot, on top of the Commission and followers. But now we need to actually engage the top decision makers with the scenarios. And so that's by the Finnish presidency of the European Union. And so that was a very key moment to influence strategic thinking from the people in charge using Foresight. And then we moved into vision building, because after having created scenarios and explored the range of possible futures, the question came about, yes, but what is the future we want to build? And so we created this vision together with our experts, and then also engaged the decision makers with that vision in order to have something which was politically accepted to be able to underpin the future development of EU policy in the domain of customs. So that's really the overall process we followed, really embedded in policymaking at European level. And the big red arrows are just indicating key moments where we also engage in communication with, in big policy meetings with the EU and the member states to really keep them abreast of our progress and explain to them how they could use the results of our foresight. We involved a lot of people with this, just to give you an idea of the diversity of the group we put together to build this collective intelligence. Very quickly, the scenarios that we developed, so you see they're quite in-depth, organized around a geopolitical axis and an economic axis. Very classic work, short description of the scenarios. Then we built that tool to help people actually engage with the scenarios and explore what the scenarios would mean for them. So we organized that in one of these short formats, 2.5-hour sessions with key decision makers, and then they play a role in there to understand what scenarios mean or could mean. And so that was the Helsinki event where we engaged with the top people. Here you can see the Secretary General of the World Customs Organization at one of the tables. And that really fed a brainstorming, where we could ask very specific questions. What key elements for the future of customs emerge from the scenario exploration? What are the current strengths and weaknesses of the customs union? So people really could apply real thinking on the concrete topics they are invested in and apply it to a long-term reflection that triggered then a question on how do you see the future state of the customs union in 2040? So really to introduce the discussion about the future of the long-term vision. So I'll pass very quickly, the time is very short about, the benefits of a vision, but that's the vision that we developed for the customs union. So something very concrete, very applied, really fit for the frame within which we operated. So that was generated with this broad group of experts. And then we engaged with the policymakers to really refine that vision and have a final text which is really adopted as underpinning official EU policy in terms of customs. And then after that, then of course, once you have a vision, the question is, okay, how do we get there? And so what we did is we engaged with, again, a lot of decision makers to roadmap, to create an image of what would be the key milestones that would be needed to achieve this vision, considering that we know where we're starting from today. And so we engaged in this exercise where we asked people to imagine a roadmap on the left-hand side, where resources would be constrained, so you cannot do everything you would like to do, and so how would you go about it to do this? Or on the right-hand side, if you're in an ideal world and you don't have to really think about resources, then what would be the ideal path forward to create that vision? And then we use that to help people identify who should do what in order to be able to achieve that vision, in a very applied way. So, we had these templates that were used to identify, okay, what are the specific objectives to be obtained along the way for the milestones? And in this, who should do what in terms of, the actors, commercial actors, in terms of the commission, the policy members, the member states, National Customs Office, everybody. So, we could highlight, a real concrete path forward distributing the roles for each of the stakeholders involved in the policy-making process to actually achieve that vision. Something very applied and very practical. And then, of course, that allowed us to build on the Foresight process to push the reflections further, in terms of the customs union, and put policymaking into a long-term perspective, which is very often difficult to achieve because there is such a pressure from the present. That's all I wanted to say with you. Sorry for having been a bit long and complex. Any question you might have, I'm ready to answer. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Laurent. There are a lot of notes as well that I took related to Foresight and the examples that you put in the future of customs, how actually that process of apply really real thinking and putting it into the vision, and how we can make a roadmap to achieve the vision. It's really interesting. And there are also a couple of questions that are already coming in that later I would like to ask to you as well, related how we can apply this. So thank you so much again for sharing with us. So before I open for open-end questions, we still have one distinguished speakers with us, Mbak Caca. Tapi sebelum ke Mbak Caca, tadi kita sudah melihat Bapak dan Ibu mengenai konteks future and foresight, kemudian bagaimana itu bisa diimplementasikan ke dalam kebijakan publik, dan bagaimana kemungkinan itu bisa diaplikasikan. Sebelum kita nanti lebih banyak diskusi, saya mungkin sekarang mau masuk lebih ke konteks Indonesia. Sebelum kita mempersilahkan Mbak Caca, saya akan meminta kembali sekali lagi Bapak Ibu untuk mengakses ke Slido sebelum kita masuk ke konteks Indonesia. Bisa tolong di-up. Dengan melihat bagaimana Foresight kemudian bisa diaplikasikan ke dalam pengambilan kebijakan, saya mungkin sekarang mau bertanya kepada Bapak Ibu, kira-kira bagaimana kita melihat Indonesia 20 tahun mendatang? Kira-kira apa yang Bapak Ibu kemudian, tadi kan mungkin kalau kita melihat ke depan, kita ngomongin soal Foresight, kira-kira dalam satu kata 20 tahun ke depan Indonesia itu seperti apa? Resilient, menarik, Indonesia emas. Ada lagi mungkin yang ingin menyampaikan? Consumer, adaptif, apakah mungkin sebagai kita semakin mungkin konsumerismenya semakin tinggi ya, resilient yang cukup banyak. Kemudian adaptif, develop, ada yang bilang juga automation. Ada yang sangat optimis dengan kita bisa mencapai green and sustainable Indonesia. Developed. Cukup banyak yang bisa yang menjawab 20 tahun dari sekarang Indonesia akan green juga, dan selain resilient. Kemudian juga ada yang implementing rule of law, kemudian juga ada many plausible future, crowded, sekarang saja sudah crowded ya, jadi mungkin 20 tahun lagi Indonesia semakin crowded. Terima kasih banyak Bapak Ibu, silakan kalau masih mau melanjutkan, kira-kira membayangkan 20 tahun lagi Indonesia seperti apa. Dan sekarang saya mau transisi ke Mbak Mariska, yang kebetulan sudah mengadopsi bagaimana pendekatan strategic foresight bisa dimanfaatkan di lingkungan Bappenas dalam konteks MSMI atau UMKM. Mungkin Mbak Caca, saya mengundang Mbak Caca untuk bisa cerita bagaimana kemudian di Direktorat PUKMK Foresight sudah diaplikasikan, dan kira-kira perbedaannya dengan yang biasanya dilakukan oleh Direktorat PUKMK itu seperti apa, karena tadi di awal Mingke menjelaskan ini di luar business as usual, jadi mungkin pengen dengar juga cerita dari Mbak Caca seperti apa. Silakan Mbak Caca.
Baik, terima kasih Mbak Desi. Yang saya hormati Bapak Sesmen Bappenas, Bapak Kepala Pusat dan Bank Pak Irfan Saleh, dan Head of Pulse Lab Jakarta Bapak Petrarca Kareci, Bapak Ibu speakers dan peserta webinar lainnya. Izinkan saya menyampaikan materi dalam bahasa Indonesia. Pada kesempatan kali ini saya akan menceritakan sedikit secara singkat mungkin ya pengalaman kami dalam melakukan strategic foresight dengan metode horizon scanning pada proses perencanaan kebijakan UMKM. Slide saya udah jalan belum? Sorry.
Belum jalan. Masih slide yang pertama Mbak Caca.
Oke, maaf ya. Mungkin sedikit overview project collaboration kita. Kami di Direktorat Pengembangan UMKM bersama dengan Pusat Renbang dan Pulse Lab Jakarta ini memiliki kemitraan analitika yang bertujuan untuk memperkuat usaha mikro kecil menengah atau UMKM dalam konteks pertumbuhan inklusif dan berkelanjutan. Kemitraan analitika ini kami mulai inisiasi di pertengahan tahun 2021 dan rencananya akan berakhir di akhir tahun 2022. Nah, dua kegiatan utama dari kemitraan analitika ini, yang pertama adalah pembangunan dashboard analitika data UMKM yang nantinya akan dapat menampilkan data-data UMKM dalam bentuk spasial dan juga analitikanya. Nah, yang kedua adalah studi strategic foresight dengan menggunakan metode horizon scanning. Studi ini bermaksud untuk mengeksplorasi faktor-faktor yang mempengaruhi masa depan UMKM di Indonesia. Tadi sudah banyak dijelaskan oleh pembicara sebelumnya mengenai strategic foresight. Nah, mungkin saya refresh sedikit kalau di dalam konteks perencanaan kebijakan ini kami memang menggunakan metode horizon scanning. Jadi horizon scanning ini adalah merupakan salah satu alat utama dan juga proses awal di dalam strategic foresight. Nah, karena memang tujuan kami tadi adalah ingin mengeksplor isu dan perkembangan yang berpotensi mempengaruhi masa depan UMKM, maka selanjutnya yang dilakukan adalah proses pengumpulan data ataupun bukti-bukti untuk mengidentifikasi potensi, peluang, dan hambatan tadi yang dapat mengubah landscape UMKM di masa depan. Lalu horizon scanning ini merupakan proses yang cukup terstruktur karena ini juga nanti akan mencakup case study, literature review, kemudian ada survei dan wawancara dengan para pakar dan juga focus group discussion. Lalu, mengapa kami melakukan studi foresight dengan metode horizon scanning?
Horizon scanning, the foundation of strategic foresight, the aim is to stimulate forward thinking and thereby enhancing strategic decision.
Depan atau forward thinking gitu. Jadi ketika kita berpikir jauh ke depan, semestinya kita akan dapat membayangkan berbagai skenario di masa depan dan ini juga akan meningkatkan kesiapan kita akan masa depan gitu. Dan pada akhirnya nanti kita diharapkan dapat mengambil keputusan yang jauh lebih strategis dan lebih baik. Secara khusus studi ini bertujuan untuk memahami perkembangan potensi yang dapat mempengaruhi masa depan UMKM dalam 5-20 tahun ke depan. Kemudian juga membangun kapasitas SDM khususnya memang di direktorat kami ini untuk memahami lebih mengenai strategic foresight melalui proses learning by doing dan untuk memberikan input atau masukan bagi rencana pembangunan jangka panjang nasional dan rencana pembangunan jangka menengah nasional untuk lebih mendukung ketahanan UMKM secara jangka panjang. Lalu seperti pada penelitian pada umumnya yang mungkin memang ada research question, di dalam studi foresight ini kami juga punya key question yaitu perkembangan apa sih yang dapat mempengaruhi masa depan UMKM dalam 20 tahun ke depan. Ini adalah proses yang kita lalui tadi seperti yang saya sudah sebutkan bahwa proses horizon scanning ini sangat sistematis dan terstruktur. Jadi ini adalah timeline-nya dapat dilihat. Studi foresight ini kami mulai di bulan April 2022 yang difasilitasi oleh Pulse Lab Finland, diawali dengan workshop pengenalan strategic foresight dan horizon scanning. Kami mengucapkan terima kasih, thanks to Minke dan tim. Kemudian setelah workshop ini dibentuk tim yang terdiri dari 12 orang scanners yang dibagi ke dalam 3 kelompok, yaitu kelompok politik dan hukum, kelompok sosial ekonomi, dan kelompok teknologi dan lingkungan. Dalam setiap proses horizon scanning ini selalu dipandu oleh pakar dari Pulse Lab Finland. Proses selanjutnya adalah mengidentifikasi berbagai sumber informasi yang terpercaya untuk mendapatkan atau menangkap sinyal dan tren di masa mendatang. Lalu masing-masing grup scanner juga perlu menentukan pakar yang akan diinterview serta melakukan peer review sumber informasi atau media yang tadi berhasil dikumpulkan. Proses scanning dan pengumpulan informasi ini dilakukan melalui manual scan pada media-media yang tadi berhasil dikumpulkan dan juga melalui interview pakar. Dalam prosesnya juga ada check-in rutin yang kami lakukan bersama dengan PLF dan PLJ untuk mungkin lebih berdiskusi mengenai bagaimana kesulitan atau tantangan yang kami hadapi dalam mengumpulkan informasi, sinyal, dan tren tadi. Selanjutnya dari hasil scan yang berhasil dikumpulkan ini dilakukan filtering untuk mengidentifikasi sinyal-sinyal yang kami rasa paling relevan berdasarkan kriteria seperti kebaruan, kemudian dampak dan kemungkinan. Nah, yang terakhir ini nantinya kemudian kami juga setelah mengumpulkan filtering tadi melakukan serial fokus group discussion yang melibatkan berbagai tokoh dan juga pakar untuk memvalidasi hasil temuan kami dan mendiskusikan mengenai implikasinya terhadap masa depan UMKM. Nah, terakhir nanti akan ada report atau laporan akhir horizon scanning. Saat ini kami masih dalam proses penyusunan report tersebut. Nah, mungkin saya ingin share beberapa aktivitas kunci dalam perjalanan horizon scanning kami. Jadi di dalam studi Foresight ini ada 12 ada dedicated scan team yang terdiri dari 12 scanners, 7 orang dari Direktorat kami, pengembangan UKM dan koperasi, dan juga 5 orang dari PLJ. Ini karena kami menyadari memang masih ada keterbatasan SDM juga di lingkungan kami, sehingga kami masih membutuhkan juga dari PLJ. Dan memang sistemnya learning by doing, jadi kita belajar sama-sama. Terima kasih untuk tim PLJ juga yang sudah berdedikasi ikutan dalam scanning dan juga memfasilitasi semuanya. Kemudian ada interview juga yang kami lakukan bersama 24 pakar dan melakukan 4 serial MGD bersama dengan 22 pakar. Dari hasil scanning yang pertama ini, kami mengidentifikasi ada 40 topik area dengan kurang lebih 115 sinyal. Kemudian setelah kami pertajam lagi melalui FGD tadi, dikerucutkan menjadi 20 tematik area dengan 45 sinyal yang lemah, gitu, yang berpotensi yang kami anggap mungkin belum selama ini belum ditangkap oleh pengambil kebijakan, tapi kami anggap ini berpotensi dapat mengaruhi masa depan UMKM di Indonesia. Lalu bagaimana kaitan strategic foresight dan horizon scanning ini dalam proses penyusunan perencanaan pembangunan jangka panjang nasional? Mungkin secara personal saya juga belum pernah terlibat langsung dalam penyusunan RPJPN sebelum yang sekarang gitu. Nah, saya juga mungkin yakin di sini banyak teman-teman Bapak Ibu yang mungkin belum pernah mengalami atau terlibat dalam penyusunan RPJPN, sehingga kami merasa cukup beruntung di Direktorat bisa ketika masa-masa penyusunan background study ini juga kami dibarengi dengan study Foresight yang tentu saja nanti hasilnya bisa memperkaya background study dan RPJPN kami. Secara garis besar, framework background study kami adalah sebagai berikut, dan nanti hasil dari studi Foresight kami akan dimasukkan ke dalam nomor 4 dan 5. Ini akan menjadi masukan yang berharga untuk mengantisipasi isu-isu strategis UMKM dan koperasi yang mungkin muncul di masa mendatang. Kemudian juga nanti ketika kita berhasil mengidentifikasi isu-isu strategisnya, nanti kita melihat kita ingin menghasilkan rekomendasi kebijakan yang lebih tepat sasaran bagi UMKM. Kemudian ini adalah reflection proses dari horizon scanning yang sudah kita jalani selama ini. Mungkin kami tidak bermaksud untuk membandingkan baik atau buruknya ataupun negatif positifnya dari metode-metode yang pernah kami lakukan sebelumnya dengan horizon scanning. Namun saya ingin lebih memperlihatkan dan akan mengenai prosesnya. Biasanya kalau di Direktorat kami dalam konteks perencanaan UMKM ini melakukan kajian termasuk background study, mungkin sebelumnya kemarin ada RPJMN, ini biasanya lebih bersifat konvensional. Kami melakukan literatur review dan study, kemudian juga berbagai FGD bersama pakar, bersama akademisi dan juga banyak stakeholder lainnya. Kemudian yang kedua juga kami melihat belum ada keseragaman metode dalam suatu kajian. Jadi begitu juga mungkin di unit-unit kerja lain di Bappenas yang mungkin menggunakan metode yang berbeda-beda, baik itu mungkin kuantitatif, kualitatif ataupun mixed method. Nah, yang ketiga adalah satu hal yang juga yang kami sadari, ini terkadang kami tidak inklusif dalam melihat isu dan permasalahan. Dalam konteks UMKM misalnya, kami banyak berfokus pada isu-isu utama seperti misalnya akses kepada sumber bahan baku, kemudian kapasitas SDM, pembiayaan, dan lain sebagainya. Padahal di luar itu mungkin masih banyak isu-isu lainnya yang kami belum tangkap gitu. Sementara dengan metode horizon scanning yang kami lakukan, ini kami mendapatkan pengalaman metode yang baru yang cukup unik menurut kami, karena metode ini tadi mendorong kami untuk berpikir jauh ke masa depan, membayangkan apa yang dapat kita lakukan saat ini untuk mengantisipasi perubahan di masa depan gitu. Dan bagaimana memikirkan kemungkinan itu bisa terefleksikan dari pengambilan keputusan yang kami buat nantinya. Nah, selanjutnya juga ini tadi ya, lagi-lagi saya tekankan metodenya sangat sistematis dan terstruktur. Jadi banyak tahapan yang sudah kami jalani dari pengumpulan informasi tadi, kemudian interview dan juga FGD. Lalu ini juga yang terakhir juga ingin menekankan kembali bahwa Foresight dan horizon scanning ini bukan seperti forecast atau predictive method gitu. Jadi ini kita lebih banyak mengeksplorasi mengenai faktor-faktor yang plausible, yang mungkin akan sangat mungkin terjadi di masa depan. Khususnya ini yang masih biasanya belum ada di radar pengambil kebijakan gitu. Jadi kami merasa metode horizon scanning ini sangat inklusif, memandang dari berbagai kacamata, baik itu tadi dari politik, kemudian hukum, sosial, ekonomi, teknologi, dan juga lingkungan, sehingga ini menjadi sangat inklusif. Kemudian ini yang terakhir, keluaran dari horizon scanning ini adalah nanti tersusunnya laporan yang kami susun bersama dengan UN Global Pulse, bersama dengan Bappenas. Kemudian nanti ada user manual juga yang akan bisa diakses oleh publik. Dan rencananya kami akan melaunching Horizon Scanning Report ini pada tanggal 12 Desember 2022 melalui 1 hari ya, full day workshop yang nantinya juga akan ada Foresight Clinic yang menghadirkan para pakar Foresight. Dan kami berharap nanti Bapak Ibu bisa bergabung dalam event ini dan memanfaatkan kesempatan untuk berdiskusi mengenai potensi penggunaan strategic Foresight dan Horizon Scanning di masing-masing lingkungan unit kerja Bapak Ibu. Akhir kata, saya ucapkan terima kasih atas perhatian Bapak Ibu rekan-rekan sekalian dan mohon maaf apabila ada kesalahan dan kekurangan dalam penyampaian kami. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak Mbak Caca, sangat insightful. Terima kasih juga sudah share beberapa hal yang menjadi highlight dan bagaimana mungkin itu bisa saling komplement ya Mbak Caca dengan proses yang saat ini sudah berjalan di Bappenas sendiri untuk RPJPN, dan juga ada beberapa pertanyaan Mbak Caca mungkin terkait bagaimana ini secara lebih lanjut bisa dimanfaatkan. Nanti saya akan tanyakan ke Mbak Mariska juga. Baik Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan, sekarang kita akan masuk ke sesi untuk diskusi. Sudah banyak sekali pertanyaan yang masuk ke dalam Slido dan juga tadi ada yang masuk juga ke dalam Zoom yang akan saya tanyakan kepada para pembicara. So, distinguished speakers, there are a lot of questions that I would like to ask.
Jadi ada pertanyaan yang ingin saya sampaikan kepada Anda supaya kita bisa mendapatkan diskusi lebih mendalam.
Marius, related to some examples that you already shared earlier. The one that is.
Pertama, saya ingin bertanya kepada Pak Mariu.
Where the examples of real implementation of the concept, preferably for developing countries like Indonesia. So probably the question is more like we heard the examples, for example, from EU, but there are questions really looking forward for the context of developing countries. Maybe if you have any experience with that and the benefit of it, whether there are challenges as well. So would like to hear more about that examples. And then the second one, there is a questions as well. I will direct this question to Minke. So if you could share the example where recommendation from Foresight are used in combination with other methodologies. So is there any possibilities of combining one with the other methodologies. So that's the second questions. And then the third questions, I would like to give it to Laurent. There is a questions. So from the Zoom, there is Bappenas has a lot of planners because this is a Ministry of Development Planning. Do you recommend the Bappenas team to also have, for example, for horizon scanning, scanners? Do you recommend Bappenas to acquire certain tools and dedicated processing units in terms of Bappenas to also explore how to more applying strategic foresight in a more systematic way? So that's the question that is coming to the Zoom. And then for Mbak Caca, there is also a question related to how actually Bappenas could implement this in more systematic way. Mungkin Mbak Caca kalau boleh bisa eksplor lebih lanjut kira-kira dengan proses yang kemarin dilewati, kira-kira supaya prosesnya lebih bisa sistematik ke depan, day to day-nya kemarin mungkin sudah dirasakan, kira-kira proses yang perlu dilakukan itu seperti apa. So I think there are, I'll stop there first for 4 different questions. There are more coming, but I'll go first to Marius. Maybe if you could give more example, if you have any examples from developing countries, or if you would like to expand further about the examples from the South Africa or Oman that you shared earlier with us.
So thank you for the question. Very interesting. I think I might cite 2 quick examples from South Africa and one from the broader African region. One of the very famous foresight exercises from South Africa took place in 1990. Between 1990 and 1994, when South Africa was going from apartheid to democracy, and we had a history of social and racial division in the country. And the Montfleur scenarios, which was a process by a group of stakeholders from across the racial divides, across ideological divides, across political divides, created a set of scenarios of how South Africa might move from racial division and inequality towards democracy without losing our fiscal, our public financial integrity. And so that was a very successful use of foresight to allow key decision makers, key leaders from across a spectrum of backgrounds to see the situation similarly. And very famously in those scenarios, they used the image of the flight of the flamingos. Flamingos are birds that fly in a perfect formation. And they used the image of the flight of flamingos together as instead of the image of a ostrich, which sticks its head in the sand, where government pretends that there's no problem and sticks its head in the sand, to communicate the need for South Africans to come together. And so in countries like Indonesia, with very big diversity, with diverse society, religious diversity, social and ethnic, as well as economic differences, scenarios can be very powerful in bringing people together. The other one I might cite is work we did during the first half of the COVID pandemic. We collaborated with the Institute for Security Studies and the United Nations Development Program to think about the long-term impact of COVID on Africa. And so what we did is we convened 20 groups of experts from 20 countries, and these are economists, political scientists, civic activists in each country, and created these small dialogues in these countries. And then we connected all 20 countries' groups of experts together in a virtual platform and had a conversation about what are the economic, social, humanitarian consequences of COVID for Africa. So in that project, we used modeling software from the Pardee Center in the US to look at the quantitative impacts that COVID might have on the economy or on people's food security. And then we used the qualitative dialogue between the experts who understand the country at the grassroots to debate and engage with the quantitative data. And what that did is it created a very powerful set of policy insights about the types of impacts that COVID might have. And one of them, of course, was increases in poverty and food insecurity, to which governments then were able to respond with things like social grants. What I will do is I'll share a link to some of that work with the organizers if you'd like to have a look at that material.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting, Marius, to hear the examples of that too, about the cases that you shared earlier. just want to expand a bit of based from those two examples. How did they found it different with the one that they usually use in terms of making the policy and then responding to different challenges that they found in terms of the diversity as well as for the combination of qualitative and quantitative? How did they find it different with the usual method that they use?
So that's a very interesting question. I think in the case of Montfleur, where you had people from different ideological backgrounds and racial and historical backgrounds coming together, the real shift was that instead of those individuals thinking about the future limited by their own ideology, their own history, their own identity, what they were able to do is to envision a future which is a shared future in which diverse ideologies and histories can coexist, which is a very powerful shift in the mindset of the participants. And so very often when we do foresight, we say to people, the process is the product. When you do foresight, yes, we'll write a report. Yes, we'll print it with a nice cover. But the report, the foresight report, is not the product. It's the process that's the product. Because it's during the process that people have an aha moment, or they have a shift in their thinking or their attitude in that environment. And then on the impact of COVID in Africa, policymakers are very good at looking at the quantitative data that is historic and the hindsight. And so the real magic, if I can call it that, or the surprise of foresight, is that it allows policymakers to become sensitized to policy issues that have not yet become policy issues. So they were able to understand that food insecurity is going to become a social crisis on the back of a health crisis because of an economic shock in the form of lockdown. And so that ability to shift their thinking into the anticipation space instead of the historical space, I think, was the key difference.
It's great. Thank you for sharing that. So the process is actually the product, not the product. The report is not the product itself. So it's interesting. I'll go to Minke as well for you to also respond to the question that I mentioned earlier, whether there is a recommendation how the foresight is used in combination with other methodologies, which Marius actually already started with giving the example of the one in the Africa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daisy and Marius. It's so inspiring to hear. And I think this is actually what we also learned during this Horizon Scan, right? It's definitely not about the end report that we're working on now, but we've learned so much throughout this entire process with Bappenas together to really contextualize everything that we've learned and kind of also contextualize the process itself. So yes, and I think, Daisy, there's so much to learn still for us as UN Global Pods to kind of combine all those methods, right? We have the quintet of change from our common agenda is highlighting not only strategic foresight, also behavioral science and data science. We should not treat them as like separate silos and separate methodologies, but we should kind of see how those different the different strengths of these methods can actually contribute to the bigger picture. But it's not an easy job, right? And I think there's often kind of a false like dichotomy between forecasting and foresight, where forecasting is it's different, but I think they're both complementary, and they should be. Like forecasting is more about data and trend analysis, and that helps us to understand the trends, right? So kind of the emerging issues, but it's not enough. It should not stop there. And I think that realization that you need foresight to really explore in a wider sense what could be the potentially emerging issues and how could the system really evolve. So we need horizon scanning, and we need kind of driver and system mapping, and we need to develop scenarios. And so seeing this constantly as versus forecasting versus foresight is not really helpful. I think we should kind of leverage the strength of both approaches, and that's a learning journey, and not only for us, I think for the broader foresight community. Yeah, let's let's make an effort to kind of see how we can
Thank you,
do
Minke.
that.
So yeah, I know that combination is of course needed in combining different methods. It's not like one the other way around or just versus, but it's actually how we combine that as kind of like a process to complement in each other. So Laurent, the question that I mentioned earlier with you about how Bappenas is actually consists of different planners, with the one that they're planning to incorporate strategic foresight into the process of planning. How do you recommend Bappenas can incorporate this process? Do we need a real human resources? Like, do we need a specific unit? So how is it in comparing with the EU context, for example? What do we need in terms of applying?
Thanks for this question. It's a very difficult question. So if I reflect back on our own reality, first I have to say that we do horizon scanning. We have a routine exercise, which is embedded in our operation. And I think that this is actually illustrating very much the dual nature of our promotion of the use of foresight across our organization. So yes, and you've seen with the short history that I've given you this morning, that we have specifically institutionalized units of people who are actually practicing foresight. But it is very important to actually spread the foresight literacy beyond that and to really spread this culture, in wherever people work, and for horizon scanning, for example, we have developed a network of what we call horizon scanners, who collect information for us and who are invited regularly to sense-making sessions, to analyze the results. And that helps spread this understanding of foresight and this foresight culture across the organization. So that's one thing. Another thing is, in the EU, we've developed this better regulation practice. So we try to always improve our capacity to do policymaking. And so for this, we've developed a toolbox. And recently, last year, or 2 years ago now, actually managed to include foresight in the toolbox. How foresight is officially recognized as one of the methods that people can and have to use to do better policymaking. And in particular, we're using scenarios to perform what we call ex-ante impact assessment. So when we develop a policy, we want to, try to assess, what's the likely impact of that policy. And traditionally, people do forecasts to do that. They use economic models and they just make it to numbers. And people discovered that this is not enough. And so we are starting to use scenarios to help people understand more completely, in a more holistic manner, what potential future impacts of that policy could be and what challenges could be found to implement these policies. And we start to use foresight to do this kind of thing. And the third thing is, we are also engaged as a foresight unit in training, in providing foresight trainings to our colleagues from across the different services of the Commission. Even though it's not going to make them foresight experts because their job is not to do foresight, at least they will know how to use the results of foresight. And they will also understand when they need to call on foresight to help them in their work. That's very important to promote this culture across the organization. So it's a two-strand approach. One is, yes, we need a few units with a few people who actually are experts in foresight and can do foresight projects, but we need to also spread the word, spread that culture across the organization so that the people involved in the policy-making work can actually know how to call on the foresight experts to actually do foresight for them and to make it useful.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lauren. I took a note about that kind of thing. And I also remembered that was also being mentioned by Marius, just thinking about the overall ecosystems that needs to be in place, yeah. Not only kind of like having that kind of unit, but really go beyond just one unit, but thinking about the more ecosystems that needs to be in place for the strategic foresight to be applied. That comes to the next questions that I asked to Mariska. With the experience that you already have with horizon scanning, for example, how do you think Bappenas could apply in more systematic way if they would like to incorporate the strategic foresight into their daily-to-day basis?
kasih Mbak Desi. Dari pengalaman kami melakukan strategic foresight ini, sebenarnya yang paling pertama mungkin bisa kita terapkan dalam pikiran itu
we can actually implement practically is the idea that this is feasible across all sectors. We can apply this across all sectors. So based on our collaboration with Pulse Lab, I know that the use case is specifically for MS.
Lintas sektor di Bappenas begitu. Kemudian yang mungkin perlu dipersiapkan.
Bappenas is handling, but also what we need to prepare is the efforts and commitment in terms of resources, the people, and also time. So once we have these resources, because this is a process that is quite exhaustive from April all the way to December. So making sure that you can make a structured schedule or time to do it in the midst of our activities. As for the question of whether we need a separate unit in Bappenas or not, I think what really is needed is just how to replicate all the learnings that we have from different exercises that we do. So once again, commitment and time, having that time is really, really necessary, because this is something new. I know that we're all learning, and we do need a strong guidelines from the experts on how to do this, because we begin from training, we begin from guided workshops, and each of these workshops, I like how we have the guides on what is the purpose of what we're doing here, what are we going to do, and that is very, very nice. Thank you very much, Chacha. And just to continue on what Chacha mentioned and also Lohang mentioned earlier, you need
mengintegrasi strategic foresight ini ke dalam policy planning. Dan kebetulan dari project ini yang saat ini kami sedang kerjakan dengan Direktorat PUKMK akan ada toolkit yang akan available. Mudah-mudahan Bapak Ibu bisa akses di bulan Desember bersamaan dengan launching, karena toolkit itu mudah-mudahan dapat membantu at least untuk proses horizon scanning itu seperti apa.
So that you'll get to know hands-on what horizon scanning is. So we have
maybe I'll go again to Marius, if that's okay. There is a question. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that it's important to have that ecosystem and then that literacy about what is foresight and how to integrate, etc. There is a question: what will happen when foresight was developed with a lack of capability, and what is actually needed for us to starting implementing that foresight?
Just to clarify quickly, was the question what will happen when that capability has been developed? What will that look like?
So when the capability is still lacking in terms of when they are starting about doing that foresight.
So I think that there is a process. One has to accept that anytime you're bringing a new technical competence into an institution, that in and of itself will be a process. And you may need to rely on partners and supporters outside of the institution to bring those skills and capabilities into the institution. But ideally, over time, what will happen is individuals, and then as Lorena also has explained, the processes themselves and the institutional structures will begin to adopt and embed foresight until foresight becomes a normal everyday practice within that institution. Maybe one other thought to add is there is the risk, when we're talking about formal government planning, someone in the chat also said formal government planning is really about politics, and politics is really about legitimacy. And so there is a risk as we fail to integrate foresight, if we fail to develop the competencies for foresight, what tends to happen over time is our plans become less relevant and less impactful. As Minka's graphic on the rate of change also showed, a relevance gap emerges. And the real risk of that is that our institutions then lose legitimacy. And we see this around the world where there's a lack of trust in institutions. And so foresight is not only solving the ability of the institutions to look ahead, they're also solving or working on the ability of the institutions to build legitimacy and participation with the population or the people that those institutions represent.
Thank you so much. That's also addressing the further questions that I would like to ask with you, because as Pa Khairil mentioned in the chat box, that is actually a political process, and thinking about how that can be built as kind of like a legitimacy is the one that we need to take account as well. I'll still have a couple of questions. I would like to ask, when you already mentioned about the plausible futures, there are a couple scenarios that need to be made. There is a question about how do you prioritize among several plausible futures? Do we need to select all scenarios, or how do you actually prioritize them? I will open whether Laurent, Minke, or Marius or Bacaca would like to answer about this. Probably Minke, would you like to, or Laurent?
I can go first, and I think Laurent also unmuted himself. It's not maybe really necessary about prioritizing a certain scenario. That's not really the purpose of doing a scenario exercise. So really the purpose of doing a scenario exercise is that you kind of what you do prioritize is kind of what is really for the topic that we are addressing. For example, MSME, what are like the key uncertainties for this future, right? For the future of MSME. So you kind of want to understand that a bit better. That's something you prioritize, but then building upon that, you draft scenarios. But the purpose of doing those scenarios is that you want to test, for example, the policies and the strategies that you have in place. Are they still valid in those worlds? Are they still kind of hold the test of the future, right? And if maybe your policy or your strategy works in one scenario but fails in the other 3 or 4, then you might want to rethink your policy there, because then it's not really robust. If it works across the different scenarios that you've outlined, then it's probably a good way to proceed. So that's maybe as the same basically as Foresight. It's really about the process. It's also about scenario thinking. It's not about scenarios as an end in themselves. It's kind of what you do with it. It's a tool to kind of make you think about the future. Maybe now over to Laurent, who has probably a lot of experience in the EU context with doing scenarios.
Thanks a lot, Minke. No, I agree completely with what you said, and I was going to say something very similar. And actually, this is the core of what ex ante impact assessment, which is a formal step in the policymaking process, where we actually use scenarios exactly to do what you said. We stress test the policy, whether the policy is going to survive across different kinds of scenarios to see whether it's robust moving forward towards the future. And then also back to what Marius was saying earlier, the process is very important. And how inclusive the process is also very important, because very often what we see in the Commission, but I think it's not typical of the Commission, it happens in many governments. People tend to consult the usual culprit. It's always the same stakeholders that the government consults. It's an industry association, it's whatever. You have a few set people or organizations that are always consulted about policy initiatives, but this is not complete enough. So very often, there's a whole range of stakeholders which is forgotten. That's one point. And the second point is that in the standard consultation processes, people are consulted one by one. And so Foresight allows to be engaging with all of them, plus the non-classic culprits, I would say. So you enlarge the capacity to engage with people. And when you engage with them all at the same time, which allows you to generate this collective intelligence that you don't have if you just consult them one by one. So the Foresight process there is really essential, and I really support what Marius was saying earlier, saying that the important is not so much the shiny report at the end, even though we always produce one, but it's more what happens on the way towards the report.
Thank you so much, Minke and Laurent, for sharing that. So again, the emphasis on the process, and it's not about like choosing one another, but literally thinking about how we actually considered everything into all the process that we have. Unfortunately, we run out of the time, but I would like to again say thank you to all the distinguished speakers for sharing with us today. We learned a lot from all of you. Hopefully we can still go in touch, because Bappenas is really interested how to incorporate strategic foresight into their policy planning. So again, thank you very much for all the speakers, for all your time, and then the presentations. So for the next one on the agenda, we have just for recapping everything with what we have learned today, I will go to Messi Angelina, our social systems lead from Pulse Lab Jakarta. Mbak Messi, silakan.
Terima kasih Desi, dan terima kasih juga untuk semua pembicara untuk diskusi yang sangat menarik pada siang hari ini. Saya ingin berbagi pada Bapak Ibu sekalian beberapa poin yang saya refleksikan ketika mendengarkan paparan yang begitu menarik dari pembicara-pembicara kita. Yang pertama, walaupun strategic foresight mungkin sebagai sebuah terminologi sudah tidak asing lagi bagi para perencana, bagi orang jadi isu pembangunan, yang saya betul-betul tangkap tadi ada beberapa hal. Yang pertama, fungsinya strategic foresight ini adalah sebagai wake up call sebetulnya. Kita memang sebagai perencana, sebagai orang yang bekerja di isu pembangunan, sebagai bagian dari PBB, kita banyak sekali bergantung pada data yang ada di masa lalu, pola dari hasil riset, tapi seperti yang pembicara-pembicara kita ingatkan, pola ini bisa berubah karena rate perubahan jauh lebih cepat, jauh lebih pesat dibandingkan apa yang terjadi sebelumnya. Jadi kita memang perlu mengantisipasi, melihat sinyal perubahan, dan membentuk
signals and to build and shape our vision so that we can ensure development for the better.
Pun terminologi strategic foresight sepertinya cukup umum dan sering didengar, sebenarnya proses ini adalah proses yang sistematis dan terstruktur. Tadi banyak contoh yang kita sudah dengar tentang bagaimana proses ini bisa dilakukan dengan sistematis dan juga berbagai metodologi dan juga alat yang bisa kita gunakan untuk proses ini. Tapi walaupun ini adalah metode yang sistematis dan terstruktur, hal lain yang saya refleksikan adalah bahwa foresight ini bukan hanya menjadi sesuatu yang dimiliki atau bisa dilakukan oleh pakar-pakarnya. Kepakaran memang penting, dan seperti yang tadi disampaikan oleh Mbak Mariska dari Bappenas, memang kita memerlukan pakar-pakar foresight untuk bisa membimbing orang-orang yang mungkin baru belajar atau memfamiliarkan dirinya dengan metode ini untuk bisa melakukannya. Tapi sebetulnya inti dan kunci dari proses strategic foresight seperti yang disampaikan pembicara tadi ada di yang saya sebut sebagai collective intelligence gitu, atau kecerdasan kolektif, kecerdasan bersama. Strategic foresight yang bagus bukan sesuatu yang dilakukan oleh seorang ahli di luar sana yang kemudian kita dapat hasilnya berupa report, berupa video, sesuatu yang di-launch, tapi strategic foresight adalah proses bersama. Proses di mana kita semua bisa membangun otot gitu ya, otot kita untuk mengerjakan strategic foresight gitu. Jadi ini hal yang penting untuk kita ingat bersama, bahwa pendekatan untuk melakukan strategic foresight bukan hanya bergantung pada kepakaran, tapi bagaimana kita bisa benar-benar bekerja bersama, menjangkau stakeholder yang ada di luar comfort zone kita, seperti yang tadi disebutkan oleh Mbak Mariska juga, bagaimana kita bisa lebih inklusif, melibatkan orang muda, kelompok yang termarginalkan, orang yang selama ini tidak dilibatkan dalam proses perencanaan. Proses strategic foresight bisa membantu kita untuk lebih bekerja sama dengan kelompok-kelompok yang selama ini mungkin tertinggal dari proses perencanaan. Dan yang kedua, seperti yang dibahas tadi ketika kita diskusi dan dari Q&A, perencanaan juga proses yang politis. Jadi memang penting untuk bersama-sama mendiskusikan strategic foresight dan insight yang didapatkan dari proses ini, supaya jadi punya legitimasi dan kita bisa sama-sama memikirkan tindakan apa yang bisa diambil, kebijakan apa yang bisa dibentuk, dan bagaimana kita bisa menuju visi yang lebih inklusif dan lebih resilient untuk negara kita Indonesia. Jadi kurang lebih itu beberapa refleksi yang saya dapatkan dan ingin saya sampaikan untuk merangkum diskusi kita hari ini. Selanjutnya saya ingin juga menyampaikan bahwa Pulse Lab Jakarta dan keluarga besar UN Global Pulse sangat mengapresiasi ketertarikan dan juga upaya Bappenas untuk berpikir lebih antisipatif untuk membentuk rencana pembangunan jangka panjang di Indonesia. Selain inisiatif yang kita kerjakan bersama dengan Direktorat PUKMK, kami juga sering mendengar dari rekan-rekan Bappenas tentang bagaimana ada proses scenario planning yang sedang berjalan dan lain-lain. Pertanyaannya mungkin sekarang seperti yang tadi ditanyakan juga ketika di bagian Q&A, bagaimana proses ini bisa bergerak dari mungkin unit atau bagian tertentu menjadi sesuatu yang dikembangkan bersama dan diterapkan lebih sistematis di dalam Bappenas. Apabila rekan-rekan Bappenas tertarik untuk mengeksplorasi ini lebih lanjut, keluarga besar UN Global Pulse akan dengan senang hati melanjutkan kemitraan dan mengeksplorasinya bersama dengan rekan-rekan Bappenas. Demikian dari saya, terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak Mbak Messi atas refleksi dan juga rangkuman dari diskusi kita hari ini. Lagi-lagi terkait dengan proses itu yang sudah kita dengar bersama, bagaimana kita sebagai secara kolektif berproses untuk melihat bagaimana foresight kemudian bisa diimplementasikan dan juga untuk menjadi sebuah legitimasi. Terima kasih banyak sekali lagi Mbak Messi dan juga tadi kepada para speaker yang sudah menyampaikan paparannya kepada kami. Dan sekali lagi saya juga mengucapkan terima kasih kepada para pejabat, Bapak Ibu, rekan-rekan dari lingkungan di Bappenas atas waktunya yang sudah mendengarkan webinar ini dari awal hingga akhir. Sebelum menutup, saya akan mempersilahkan Pak Muhammad Irfan Saleh, PLT Kepala Kabus Datin Renbang Bappenas, untuk bisa menyampaikan closing remarks-nya. Kepada Pak Irfan, kami persilahkan.
Terima kasih Bu Desi. Yang terhormat Pak Asmen, distinguished speakers, Ibu Mika, Pak Lauren, Pak Marius, Mbak Caca. Ini terima kasih sekali, sore ini kita sudah banyak belajar dan sharing mengenai beberapa hal yang terkait strategic foresight untuk policy planning. Kami juga sangat bangga bahwa hari ini kita juga kegiatan ini dihadiri banyak sekali senior di Bappenas dan teman-teman dari seluruh unit kerja, dan mungkin bisa banyak sekali pelajaran yang bisa kita ambil, dan tadi excellent summary dari Mbak Messi sebagai penutup. Saya pertama-tama untuk penutup ini mengucapkan terima kasih banyak kepada UN Global Pulse, terutama teman-teman dari Pulse Lab Jakarta dan Pulse Lab dari Finland atas fasilitasinya dalam proses ini, dan terutama pada para pembicara yang sudah hadir. Kita sadar bahwa memang untuk ketidakpastian di masa depan kita masih sangat banyak, dan saya pikir strategic foresight ini bisa jadi satu hal yang tools yang bisa kita gunakan terutama di Bappenas untuk melihat skenario-skenario yang muncul di masa mendatang. Saya pikir kalau kata kuncinya mungkin satu hal yang bisa saya angkat juga adalah the more the merrier gitu ya, artinya ketika kita bersama-sama membuat sesuatu langkah yang sistematis dan terstruktur, harusnya harapan kita bahwa ke depan kita bisa lebih optimis untuk memperoleh sesuatu. Dari pembelajaran kita selama ini, teman-teman di Bappenas, di Direktorat PUKMK dengan Pulse Lab Jakarta, kami sebagai fasilitator dalam kegiatan ini juga banyak hal yang sudah kita pelajari bersama. Di forum juga ada Pak Dading, terima kasih banyak Pak atas fasilitasinya, dan Mbak Caca. Dan mudah-mudahan nanti ketika hasil kemitraan ini kita luncurkan pada bulan Desember, kita juga bisa bersama-sama di Bappenas untuk mulai mencoba menggunakan pendekatan seperti ini dalam proses-proses kita selanjutnya. Saya pikir fasilitator dan bagaimana proses ini bisa dimoderasi dengan baik, itu satu hal yang perlu juga kita siapkan dengan baik dengan memilih beberapa mungkin pihak yang terlibat dalam proses penyusunan RPJP. Hari ini ada Pak Heri Labdini sebagai ketua dari tim RPJP tersebut. Mudah-mudahan event hari ini bisa banyak juga memberikan masukan terhadap proses tersebut. Dan sekali lagi untuk hari ini kita kegiatannya mudah-mudahan banyak sekali manfaatnya. Bahan yang disampaikan juga sudah di-share. Semoga bisa bermanfaat bagi kita semua. Pak Petra, terima kasih teman-teman dari Pulse Lab Jakarta. Saya pikir itu yang dari sambutan yang bisa saya sampaikan sebagai penutup. Sampai ketemu lagi di sesi-sesi kita berikutnya. Dan mudah-mudahan proses ini bisa kita lanjutkan dalam proses penyusunan kita, penyusunan perencanaan di Bappenas. Terima kasih Bu Desi. Dari saya sekian. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat sore.
Baik Pak Irfan, terima kasih banyak atas kata penutupnya. Saya kira sudah banyak direkap tadi oleh Pak Irfan juga bagaimana mudah-mudahan ini bisa terus menjadi manfaat bagi Bappenas. Dengan senang hati seperti yang Mbak Messi tadi sampaikan, jika ada ke depan kita ingin diskusi terkait dengan strategic foresight, dengan senang hati UN Global Pulse akan berdiskusi dan juga sekedar mengingatkan kembali tadi yang sudah disampaikan Mbak Caca di awal, di tanggal 12 Desember kami akan launching report The Future of MSMEs in Indonesia. Dan di situ juga kita akan ada beberapa klinik atau workshop yang akan terbuka untuk Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan ikuti, karena di situ kita akan mengeksplorasi secara lebih lanjut bagaimana menggunakan metode-metode foresight untuk perencanaan kebijakan ataupun pembangunan.
Akhir kata, saya ucapkan kembali terima kasih kepada para pembicara. Thank you again for distinguished speakers. Terima kasih banyak kepada Bapak Ibu dari Bappenas. Tadi sudah banyak sepertinya disebutkan yang juga gabung, ada Pak Deputi, Pak Direktur, dan juga para pejabat, staf ahli yang ikut hadir berdiskusi bersama-sama dengan kami. Mohon maaf apabila ada kekurangan dalam pelaksanaan webinar ini, dan dengan demikian kami tutup webinarnya. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih, selamat sore semua.
Teman-teman dari Divet juga terima kasih sudah ikut.
Oh betul, terima kasih.
Terima kasih semua.